Welcome back to the Budget Gamer channel, where we bring you critical and in-depth reviews of just about every indie game we can get our hands on, and today we're going to be taking a look at Going Under for the Nintendo Switch. But before we actually get into the review, I have to say this is one of those indie games that just really didn't seem like it was for me. But the longer I stuck with it and the more I played, the more it grew on me, because just looking at its surface value, I really didn't think that it was such an involved dungeon crawler. But looking at the game's story, the general premise is that in Going Under, internet startup companies that fail don't just disappear, they actually go under. And taking this incredibly liberally, they become subterranean dungeon caverns that, while much of the world might ignore their existence, at least for our main character and protagonist, who's been hired as a brand new intern, it will be her job to confront the former minions and bosses who have transformed into minions and bosses. If you are already a fan of roguelike dungeon crawlers, though, you might not immediately see anything new. The general gameplay consists of entering one of the game's 3 primary dungeons, moving from locked room to locked room as you slay every minion, pick up destructible weapons, and collect every single buff you can find to help yourself get all the way down to the boss's room. But in reality, if we look at these game artifacts, there is so much more going on. In Going Under, nearly every single item in the game is not only destructible, but usable as a weapon. And this could be anything from keyboards, laptops, office chairs, knives, swords, cactuses, body pillows, electric guitars, gigantic staplers, warhammers, or anything you can possibly imagine. And every single one of them handles just a little bit differently, has slightly different effects. And of course, as you might imagine, is completely destructible. Thankfully though, you can carry up to 3 weapons at a time, shifting through them with the L and R buttons so that you don't pin yourself into a corner when something accidentally breaks in the middle of a fight. Other than that though, as you might expect, you can pick up buffs nearly everywhere in the game. And while they do only keep their effect during whatever dungeon you pick them up in, relying on the pop culture of cell phone generations, the more often you use a particular buff, the more highly it's rated on your gaming profile, eventually letting you pull that buff with you at the very start of a dungeon. But besides the draw of dungeon crawling itself, there are additional quests and missions that you can run. And this does thankfully stave off some of the repetitious nature of even a procedurally generated dungeon. As you would expect, as an intern in a company, you also have access to one of potentially many mentors. And through your actions with your own company workplace colleagues, they'll eventually give you quests and take you on as their mentee. Mentors can, of course, be leveled up through the accomplishment of several quests and will grant you their own specific bonuses and perks for every dungeon that you play in. Certain mentors may let you access more than one buff at a time, other ones might get you more money for dungeon crawling, and other ones might agree to shoplift some items for you to make your dungeonist journey a little bit more simple. But regardless of which mentors you're playing under, fighting the bosses is going to be all on you. And as the bosses in Going Under are pretty tanky and do have several different attack patterns, it's a pretty good thing that the dungeons aren't too terribly deep. But moving on to the graphics and the audio, I have to say initially I wasn't terribly drawn to the graphics in Going Under, but the more I played with the game and realized its satirical, comical nature, the more appropriate the visuals really did seem. And so looking at the big picture for such a quirky game, I really did think the graphic quality brought a lot to the experience. Audio-wise, there is so much going on. Every single weapon has its own different sound effects, every enemy is different, and every different dungeon theme has its own background. And so even though it is a bit of a repetitious experience, if you're diving the same dungeon over and over, at least as far as the audio is concerned, you're probably not going to get tired of it. But with all this praise, it doesn't mean that Going Under is completely without its critiques. But to be perfectly honest, any critiques that I really could scrape up for the game do kind of pale in comparison to the total experience. But first and foremost would have to be the learning curve of the game itself. As I mentioned before, Going Under is not really that difficult from what you would expect from a very genre-typical dungeon crawler. But with all the new very subtle mechanics that are worked in, it does take a player a little while to really get a handle on exactly what they're doing and how to make a more successful track on their next dungeoneering adventure. And so while this might initially at least appear to be a bit of a negative, the more you play the game and the more you get a handle on how to use skills and items and how to juggle different buffs and mentors, the more satisfying and OP an experience you're going to have with each and every subsequent run. Other than that though, there was one thing visually that did strike me, at least on a couple occasions, as being a little less than perfect, and that is the camera controls. Because nearly everything in the game is actionable, the camera can get hung up on certain things, especially when you're in a very small room with a lot of enemies. And this can sometimes lead you to getting backed into a corner, or having a less than advantageous camera view and robbing yourself of quite a bit of health. But even though that is a possibility, you can simply use the LZ trigger and lock onto enemies, and pretty much just button bash your way to safety. And that does, in a sense, bring us to the game's next possible critique, is that combat is more or less to a certain extent pretty button mashy. Every single one of the game's possible usable weapons does work differently. But as attack is pretty much, other than throwing things, just the use of the A button, you don't really need to have a lot of skill if you have a lot of health. And so in that sense, real hardcore fans of the roguelike dungeon crawling genre, fans of games like Wizard of Legend or Enter the Gungeon, well, they might find the experience a little too, elementary. But for anyone else, especially if you're not typically a fan of dungeon crawlers, or especially if you're not typically a fan of roguelikes, Going Under might be a really great comical introduction to the genre itself. But anyway, that does about wrap up the review of Going Under now on the Nintendo Switch, so if you enjoyed the review, or especially if you found it helpful, feel free to throw us a comment or a like to show your support, and don't forget to click that little bell icon when you subscribe to stay updated with the latest content. Because there are new and unique indie games coming out literally every single day, and there's always something new coming out on the eShop, so whether it's an easy hard pass or an absolutely unforgettable gem, chances are if it's on the Switch, you're gonna find out about it right here. But anyway, this has been The Budget Gamer, so as always, thanks for watching.